the ultimate goal is concerned, I think none of us need have any apprehensions. None of us need have any doubt. But my fear, which I must express clearly, is this. Our difficulty, as I said, is not about the ultimate future. Our difficulty is how to make the heterogeneous mess that we have today take a decision in common and march in a cooperative way on that road which is bound to lead us to unity. Our difficulty is not with regard to the ultimate. Our difficulty is with regard to the beginning.
Welcome, folks, to the new episode of Bharatiya Janata podcast. In our episode today, I have with me Omar Ahmed. Omar is an Indian writer who has been shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize back in 2009. However, the reason that I wanted to talk to him was because I have been following him on Twitter over the years and I have been following the chain of his thoughts. And I think we often mistake, even within the educated Muslim Indian Muslim identity, we often look at it as a monolith. We often look at it as people who are educated, religious, and have their have a certain idea of India, which is decidedly anti-BJP, decidedly potentially pro-Congress. And I have felt that Omer has offered over time different point of views on different things. So with that, I will say hello, Omer. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for being here. Uh, before we, yes, you were saying something.
No, I was just laughing.
Yeah. Before we
That's what I do
started
a lot.
before we started talking about before we started recording, we were talking about liberalism, and you said that we usually beat ourselves too much on the fact of not being liberal enough. When you were saying that societies across the globe aren't as liberal as we think that they are. So would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, not to make too much of a deal about it, but there's always this kind of almost despairing cry. Ke, देखो, we were always
Hmm.
this mess. We
Hmm.
have really feudal structures. We have family setups that are deeply male oriented, and
Yeah.
we have a problem with caste that we've had embedded in our society for millennia, and that makes it a
Hmm.
problem. Now the thing is that we kind of forget how young liberalism as an idea is in terms of in political practice, right? So we say, okay, we don't give women lots of agency. But until the 70s, if you were a German woman and you needed to work, you needed written authorization from your husband, right? I mean,
Okay.
the
Hmm.
Swiss women didn't get the vote until the 60s, right? I mean, our women got the vote before the 60s.
We got the vote as soon as we became a sovereign state,
Yeah.
but and
So
I largely agree with you.
yeah, so I think, okay, so for me, my issue is here is this, is that actually no society is great on these particular aspects. Power corrupts wherever it is. And it doesn't, if you don't have accountability and you don't have transparency, power will always corrupt. And that's the key challenge of liberalism. It doesn't matter where you are. The issue isn't so much, I mean, the social structures may play into it. Of course, they play into it. But they're an aspect of power. And I think we sometimes confuse our criticism of the social aspects that entrench and allow power to be exercised without transparency, without accountability, with just the social aspect. So, if I does that make sense?
Mhm. It does,
Uh,
and which so basically, I agree with you. I completely agree with you. The thing that I slightly I won't say disagree, but I'd slightly want you to elucidate on is
mm,
this. So I I mean, we agree.
mm,
There's a lot more that can be done. There's a lot more that should be done globally and not just in India.
mm,
But I live in the States, right?
mm,
And let us quickly take the example of States.
mm,
States, by no stretch of imagination right now, is liberal in the sense the polity isn't, right?
mm.
However, and this is something that you mentioned, the institutions, at least the way I see it right now, the institutions are still strong enough that they can stand against uh, a political outfit, a president, which is who is largely being illiberal, and they like a lot like his travel ban was struck off.
Well,
What
not
I'm trying to
fully.
say is not
This is,
not fully,
yes.
of course. But
Mm,
what I'm trying to say is, and remember that this it was struck off in the lower court, not in the
mm,
Supreme Court. So
mm,
like a lower court judge
mm.
feels powerful enough to take down a president and is
Empowered to do
I mean,
so.
he's empowered to do so, and his life is not under any threat. His or her life. I don't
Yeah.
remember who the judge is, right?
Yeah.
So maybe liberalism. When I want to talk about liberalism, maybe what we should be talking about is the whole structure. One of the and it's not just about the people or the government that the people are represented by,
Mm,
but the judiciary, the police, everything. And do you not feel that when we compare ourselves to the West
mm,
on these parameters,
mm.
do we not like what do you feel? Do you
So, two things. One, I hate the word the West. I don't know what it
okay?
means. What's West?
Okay,
Is Australia West? Is Japan West? I mean, where does a West
you know,
end and begin?
I'm,
Right? So
I'm
I
laughing
hate
because yeah, okay, I agree.
I okay. So let me get my hate out on this word because
Yes,
basically, if there's a West and East, we're never going to meet.
the twain shall not meet.
Shall not meet. I mean, it just by definition, there is no point there's no point of overlap. So I think that kind of definition, unfortunately, we've allowed to sit in our heads. A lot of that comes from a history of colonialism, where Europe defined itself in a particular way. And when you say the West, what you basically mean are European states and European settler colonies.
Yeah, which is
That's
coded for white also, I guess.
Yeah, it's coded for white because it's European, right? It's European states and European settler colonies. Uh, and in a sense, also Western European states and their settler colonies. In very clear terms, there's a line that demarks parts of Middle Europe and Eastern Europe, which are not classically the West or
Yeah,
so. So, in one sense, when we talk about East and West and all of this issue, we're getting caught into these very petty fights within Europe itself because we're using their language without understanding that there's a deeper history behind those languages itself about the place of Russia, the place of Germany in the European world order, and how that came about in the 18th and 19th century, and how the politics of that has played out. And so okay, so I hate using the term Western and Eastern, and I'm not going to go there. But what I will say is, so what can we distinguish on? We can distinguish on states that have institutions of accountability and transparency and states that don't. And most of what are the developed, not all, but many of the developed countries have fairly good and robust institutions of accountability and transparency.
yeah,
We Most of the developing countries have not built those institutions yet and are still on the way of building some, and some in some cases dismantling them, depending on how it's going. And that's the basic difference I see. But when it comes to, let's say, social issues, right? When you talk about the polity not being, or being liberal or not being liberal, I don't think there's such a thing as a liberal state. A state is just a tool, it's a hammer, right? Whether you're talking about somebody like Kautilya talking about it, or you're talking about somebody like Ibn Khaldun talking about it, or you're talking about somebody like Machiavelli talking about it, they're talking about the state as an instrument of governance, right? It cannot have a, and so here's this other point that we kind of confuse things. A state does not have an ideology. It cannot have an ideology. it's
Of course.
just it's just an institution, right? Yeah, well, you say, of course, but there's people who say, okay, you have a liberal state and you have an illiberal state,
So
and
can
that's
I?
that's a basic intellectual error.
So I'll just interject for a moment.
Mm,
And I cannot obviously speak for everyone, so I'll speak for
mm.
myself. But
Yeah.
when in my head, when I hear the phrase liberal state,
Mm,
I basically hear what I think both of us have agreed on is a state that has um multiple pillars that kind of help in governing and policy making, which is
mhm,
like the executive, the judiciary, whatever, right? And all
mm.
these pillars can function with each other and independently as well, and facilitate this individual liberty of the citizen. That's the basic idea in my head of a liberal state. And the moment
Okay.
these
No, no, okay.
things
So,
are,
the question where I would stop you at is when you say that these allow for the greater individual liberty of a citizen, right?
Mhm.
That's where you define a liberal state. But a state does not actually move to guarantee the greater liberty of citizens. It does not. It cannot do
I'd
it.
want you to detail that.
Okay, so what does a state do? What can a judiciary do? A judiciary is there to make sure that the laws are interpreted according to the
Yeah.
Constitution,
Hmm.
right? Whatever the
Yeah.
Constitution is,
Yeah.
right? And to what's the legislature? It's there to pass laws, and to make sure that the and to debate those laws, and to make sure those are there. What's the executive? It's there to implement the laws, right? These are
Yeah.
your tools, various tools, and to a certain degree they can keep each other in check, or
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
the press can keep each other in check. But in and of themselves, can you say that they are there to promote the greater liberty or not of citizens? No, I do not think that you can say that. You can say they're efficient at what they do or they do not do. The outcome may be greater liberty, may not be greater liberty.
Uh, so I don't, I do not disagree. So, but like, so how
This is a very
again? Now,
subtle point which I'm trying to make over a phone call over 1,000
so
kilometers.
so
Yes.
so when so here's the thing. Now we have to take even a step back and now talk about the idea of a nation state, right? Because
Yeah.
so
Oh,
so so for
I hate
me,
the idea of a
uh,
nation state too. So I can hit on
I
that
don't
too.
I don't really. I'm not a big supporter. In fact, I recently said something on Twitter that now you can see that viruses can move across borders without visas. Your money can move across borders without visas. Why the freedom of movement is only restricted to human beings? But anyway, that's a different thing. Let's talk about it. So, but like we live in a world of nation states, right?
Mm,
And a nation state, at its most basic, is basically if you are an Indian citizen, what it
mm,
means is that you have a social contract
mm,
with these different governing bodies, and that
mm,
social contract says that as long as you follow certain rules, and by rules I mean don't kill someone, don't steal some stuff, pay your taxes, basic rules. And agree that the state will deal with implementing policies for you, your kids, and the country at large. As long as when a group of people come together and say ki, ha, you make the rules for us, and in exchange what I get is my and it's an American term, but I think the pursuit, the ability to pursue my happiness, right?
Yeah.
That's at the most fundamental level what the state is, and
Okay.
that's a liberal idea. I mean, at least I'll think of it as a liberal idea, right? That
So
I'm,
okay. So the because the so that liberal idea, the pursuit of happiness, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a liberal
exactly,
idea within the American Constitution.
yes,
Okay, so you
hmm,
can say that that is an idea that's there, and that it can be played upon and can come out, and so. But has the state has the state actually worked to guarantee the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of people?
does it not?
No, I do not think it does. And I do not think that's
Okay,
a responsibility of the state at all. I think this is where
hmm,
we make that fundamental error that the state is a tool. You can put things in the constitution, you can put things into these type of issues, but they only become lived practice by these literally the physical actions of citizens themselves and citizen bodies. And if you have strong citizen bodies that are pursuing illiberal ideas, those are what will come into practice. Does that make
yeah,
sense? Yeah. So, for
eh,
example,
hmm,
Kansas, a state in the
hmm,
US, which has very clearly life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as
yeah,
as a constitutional framework,
hmm,
says you must teach evolution only as another theory, and you can teach creationism
yeah,
as another theory, right?
yeah,
And this is
yeah,
backed by more than a century of fundamentalist thought in America.
yeah,
What does the state do? The state does nothing. The state only pursues liberal or illiberal policies depending on the mobilization of civil, or you could even call it uncivil society actors or groups of determined citizens.
i I could see where you're coming from, but isn't the fact that state does not do anything itself a liberal?
That
So
doesn't.
this is, I mean, of course. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you. Okay.
Huh. No, no, I was just saying that because because the state does not like allows them to not or teach creationism as an alternate theory. Uh, is it not being liberal to
It's
their
not being.
freedom of being stupid?
Yeah, well, it's. But the state is not. So again, you're giving a kind of anthropomorphic idea of the state. The state doesn't exist. It's institutions. The state doesn't think.
Yeah,
The state does not
yeah,
allow. Yeah. The
yeah,
institutions of the state do not do any of that. What the structure allows. And the structure allows and disallows because people actually implement that structure or not. Is slavery an American tradition? Is making is punishing African Americans out of consequence an American tradition? Is the marginalization of Native American tribes and the complete, overwriting of the treaties that the United States signed with independent Native American tribes? That's also American tradition. Does law allow for it? does the Constitution allow for it? Not sure.
Mhm.
Was the
Agreed.
incarceration of Japanese American citizens a liberal or illiberal thing? Obviously, it was an illiberal thing.
Agreed. Of course, agreed.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that it depends on the trends within society itself and who's organized and who's able and who has the power to make those choices. I do not think it's wise to look at societies and say this is a liberal society or this is a liberal state. I think it's better to say, okay, this state is freer in certain ways, it is more transparent in certain ways, it's more accountable in certain ways. Those are clearly measurable indicators that you can pretty much do,
Yeah.
right? Are people being jailed for freedom of political opinion or for political
Difference
opinions?
of
I mean,
opinion.
yeah, these type of things. You can measure these. You can't
So,
measure
so,
whether it's liberal or not liberal.
so, I mean, you put it much more articulately, definitely. But what you say, and I completely agree that there are institutions that go on making form a state, right? And these institutions working within their mandate, um, when they do work within their mandate, that allows for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for the ordinary citizen. And then we can measure how much, like, if you incarcerate American Japanese during World War II, was that within the mandate? Was that not within the mandate? Was that liberal or not? Is a discussion. So
That you
I
can
think we
have.
could, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think we could have a whole separate podcast about the whole notion of nation state. But let me pull you back to India, right? So in all those parameters, the state has clearly failed us, right?
So here's what I would say is that the state has failed us to a degree. We have failed the state far, far more.
When you say we have failed, could you?
When I say we have failed, is that to keep any institution up and running, you need you need a support structure to that institution. So let me give you a very clear example. Something like the RTI bill didn't
Hmm.
appear out of nowhere. It came after a lot of ground level work by people like Nikhil Day and all, right? Just hold the state accountable.
Yeah.
And once the state or the political parties accepted these issues and accepted it as a draft, and then actually it's one of the better laws because civil society was even asked, the people who'd campaigned this were asked to help frame the laws as well because the
Yeah.
original bill had significant issues. So oddly enough, and then your first CIC happened to be somebody who was very much in favor of the thing, so pushed it. But it was a combination of, you could say, uh, initial factors that made that law very strong. And then a number of citizens, including journalists who use it massively, made it a lived reality. A law is only actually a law when people push for it, imbibe it, use it. Right? And the same way you could say the freedom of expression law is less alive than the sedition and 153A and enmity, between communities laws 295A. Because people, though all of these laws exist within the Constitution, but they need operationalization before they actually become a lived reality within society.
This
So, an
you
anti,
you
yeah.
No, no, I'm just saying you bring a fair point, and
And when I say
and
we,
even
let me also be very clear. This is the
yeah. Oh yeah.
privileged, comfortable sector of India that has failed India spectacularly.
I agree.
Okay,
I mean,
it
it
is
always
not
helps
just
to.
it's not just failed; it has backstabbed and betrayed India for its own personal, uh, particular privileges to safeguard its safety nest, to safeguard the future of its incompetent and useless children. Jyoti Rao Sindhya
Okay.
is a good example of a complete piece of shit who couldn't make it anywhere, frankly, but
Yeah.
is where he is simply because legacies of protecting wealth and privilege have allowed him to be somebody important.
And that is basically caste. Like, I mean, we could talk about
Okay, caste is a
like how caste.
huge, yeah, so caste is a huge issue, and I've become a little uncomfortable with it because, to a degree, then you have to bring in the fact that caste actually runs across all religious communities,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's codified in only one. And that's where the problem lies with somebody who's not from that community addressing it.
I will not ask you to stretch on caste as of now. We will pause. I want to go back to something that we were talking before this, right? So you said we have failed the state, we have failed the larger society,
When we
um,
okay, so
and
let me
we
say,
privileged, the privileged.
yeah, let me put it slightly differently. We haven't so much failed the state as we have failed our fellow citizens, because the state again is only a contract. It's not a real thing. So let me say that again and again. It's
Fair,
not. I
fair.
can't. I can't fail the state because the state is part of me. It's my creation. It does not judge me. It has no locus standi. The state is a figment of imagination. But I can say that I fail my fellow citizen. I can say that I fail my fellow citizen who's forced to go down the sewer and into piles of shit to clean human feces.
Even in 2020.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a failure that I can understand. The state is is a piece of imagination. I cannot fail it because it doesn't exist. Right?
But
Uh,
it does I mean, okay, I see where you're coming from,
I'm saying
and
that as a moral issue. Right, I can break a law or I can not break a law. I can do this, but the state I will separate from the human component of a country, which is I have failed my fellow citizens. I not necessarily, the state has no moral demands on me. The state is nothing. It doesn't exist. I'm sorry, I will not give it that relevance. The state is only our, as you said, a common social contract that we have all signed. And in that
yeah,
common social contract, we agreed that we would take care of each other.
yeah.
And what we basically did, especially the comfortable, the rich, the privileged, in however, okay, I'm not the most privileged person in India, uh, but so I'm certainly more privileged than most of my fellow countrymen.
The fact I always say this, that the fact that you and I can talk in English by itself puts us in, I'd say, the top 3% of Indians. I'd say, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a sign of privilege.
Yeah, of course it is. The fact that even if you've got a salaried job. Okay, I'm a contract labor, so
Mhm.
maybe I don't have a salary
You
job in the exact same sense of the word.
okay.
But
I have to talk about your contract labor as well, but was that question for later.
but we basically, that was the whole point of the independence movement. The whole point of a country is that we commit to taking care of each other, right? And
Yep.
the fact that the people who have the capability to organize and to spend time and energy, because they are not necessarily living a hand to mouth existence, have basically ignored those who are living an hand to mouth existence, and forget ignored, exploited them uh, for their own personal private good, is a failure. And it cannot be said harshly enough.
My fear with this pod is that I'm getting so many different areas that we need to diverge in that. So
Okay,
um,
so
so
what do you want to focus on?
I will. So my next question. Before that, let's just close this segment and start a new segment.
So, Omer, we just talked about how a society and the phrase that you hate, nation state, is essentially a contract between people and people and the institutions, right? And in all of this, when we've kept using the term contract or social contract, it's what we basically mean is whatever the constitution of that specific country is, right? And in that light, if we look at the constitution of India or the
Mhm.
contract between you and me and the institutions, do you think that um, like it was timely? And usually when people say timely, people mean um, in time, like right in that time. But when I say timely, I mean, do you think it was the constitution as defined was apt for the people who lived in 1947? Because when I look at it, sometimes I feel that the constitution is too far ahead for people who are living in 2020 as well.
Okay, well, look, constitutions are always aspirational. So I honestly do. I hear this quite often that the Indian
Hmm.
Constitution was kind of a strange idea uh, put upon Indian society, that it did not align with Indian society, and that therefore it never set in.
Hmm.
And I'd like to push back against this idea. I mean, the first country to have a modern constitution would have been the United States.
Yeah.
And the United States has had a significant advantage over a lot of other countries because, frankly, it was European colonialists, white Anglo-Saxon male Protestants, who and a privileged elite who had that conversation, right? And so that was a small set.
Hmm.
They could have that conversation among themselves and agree to it. In the real terms of a constitution as social contract, America
Yeah.
is the best case example in that you had that very clear conversation. India, other countries, especially post colonial countries, had a much more complicated relationship, a much smaller and much less, in that sense, representative set of people sat down to talk about our constitution. But again, I think this is also stems from the ignorance of the Constitutional Assembly debates. And they were very rich. And we didn't
Hmm.
arrive at the Constitution or even the Constitutional Assembly debates from nowhere. The Congress Party, as a not so much as a party but as a movement pre-independence, had these debates for 90 years, and they had them at all levels. So to state that that the ideas came up out of nowhere or and were imported in from external sources is frankly a historical nonsense. It wasn't as if this document was just prepared in 2 days.
Hmm.
It emerged out of 90 years of actual policy public contact. So it didn't to say that it just fell in our laps, that Nehru passed this liberal constitution that came to him from Oxford days. It's just laughable. I mean, it has no relationship to reality.
I
That
so
said,
so
yeah. So
yeah.
I mean,
So go.
in one sense,
Go.
factually, it's wrong. On the other hand, the thing is, it was an aspirational document. If you look at the trajectory of all the people involved in the freedom movement, despite their different, very different ideas, whether it's Sarojini Naidu, whether it's Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whether it's Tilak, whether it's somebody like Rabindranath Tagore, all of these people are coming from it from very, very different points of views, but they're all deeply, deeply utopian thinkers. They want an India that is great. And of them, possibly the most uncomfortable thinker is B.R. Ambedkar,
Yeah.
who's asking, let's just look at the idea of a dignity of an Indian citizen as an equal citizen, which is a massively interesting idea. It did not exist in India. It still does not exist in India. But again, let's take the American example. Up till the 1960s, it didn't exist for a lot of African Americans. And even today, has racism disappeared? Is 20% of the population of African American origin makes up how much of the proportion of those jailed in America? I mean, and
Three
let's not
fourth.
even talk about the Native Americans on whose land, radioactive waste is buried and God knows what all else is done. So the idea that these were utopian ideals, of course they were utopian ideals. Of course they're looking to the future, because you cannot have a document, a constitution, a contract that is only looking to the past, because that will imprison a nation. It has to have certain core ideas that are forward looking, that are aspirational, and that allow you to fix the problems of society. So what I would suggest is that not only was the Indian Constitution an outcome of a lot of thinking, but it was also the outcome of a lot of thinking about what our problems were. And that's why it's so radical, because we had lots of problems and we still do.
While I completely agree with you, there's one thing that we kind of, or at least it is in my mind, is that if you look at the backgrounds and the profile of these people
Hmm,
who who came together and did these long years and years of discussion to come
hmm,
and form this document,
hmm,
they, and this is why the original question came upon,
hmm,
right? They do not exactly reflect the the Indian demographics even then and even now. Like most of them were uh, Western educated, be it Nehru, Ambedkar, many of the others. Most of them, especially Nehru, was heavily influenced by Fabian's socialist ideas, and and most of them were very like and classical liberal in their outlook at things, right? How whereas the
Okay,
country
I'm not sure I'd agree here. And let
and
me
yeah.
let me tell you why I don't agree. Um, One is, again, take an example of, let's say, the Constitution makers of America.
Mhm.
Definitely not representative of the American demographic at the time. And I'm not even counting the Native Americans and the African Americans. I'm talking about the white Anglo Saxon males. They were not representative at all. So, how is that different from nowadays? Secondly, you look at, there's this lovely article, I think, on feminism in India,
Mhm.
or on Lady's Finger, I think, which looks at the
Mhm.
15 women who were deeply involved in the making of the Constitution. And you look at the breadth of the types of people who came together to make this happen. These were not your liberal toffs somewhere. The guy who was the representative from Gorakhpur in the constituent assembly is this
Hmm.
awesome guy called Shiban Lal Saxena, and
Hmm.
he represents the Kisan Mazdoor movement, very much a down from the ground, labor activist. So, okay, I don't think it's true in the sense that this is an elite set. And to the degree that it's true, it's not at all different from any other country that has shaped a constitution.
Which, I mean, America is a great point. In fact, they say that all men are created equal in their preamble,
Yeah, but
and
not forget the
yeah, up
women.
until and the racial minorities up until like the last 70 years. So,
Yeah, I mean,
s-
just forget everything else. Look at the way women were treated until the
suffragists.
suffragist movement. And it wasn't until World War II that women actually got a space in the labor force that things changed. So, I mean, that from 1776 to 1950, that's a long time to be not treated in any way equal. And
S-
that's 50% of
One
your population. We had much better representation of women in the Constitution Assembly debates, if I may say so.
then the naturally the next question that has to be asked is, and I don't know how, like, because some people who might listen to this may not agree, but the most basic question that has to be asked is what went wrong, like,
Okay, so
why?
many
So
things
just look
went
at
wrong.
Gorakhpur. You gave up. Yeah, and
देखो,
I don't have
हम
a better
मेहमान
example.
नवाजी में गए
Yeah.
और हम ऐसे नहीं, but Gorakhpur is an excellent case in point because it is in response to the labor movement, to people like Shiban Lal Saxena, that Digvijay Nath, who is the Mahant at that time,
Hmm.
becomes changes the idea of Gorakhnath temple from a very because Baba Gorakhnath, if you read the literature, is a
Hmm.
very interesting guy and is not, defines himself neither as Hindu nor Muslim, define himself out of those categories, and is and the Gorakhnath Mutt itself had wasn't tied to an idea of the hard right as it became under Digvijayanath, and it became that because there was this fear from the landed elite about what the labor movement would do. And this was a great problem of the Congress, and it manifested itself very early on in the 1936 1937 elections. And when
37.
the 37, right? So when those elections happened, and you look at Gandhi's commentary on these guys who come into power and start, the first thing they do is start privileging their own communities, their friends, their relatives, their biradri, their caste groups. And he is so deeply disappointed and disheartened that he pushes for those people to resign. And this is also why Nehru says, under the cloak of national interest, many a congressman is only a communalist, because to for and the Congress movement at that point of time had a lot of elite. You needed the elite, right? You needed it to keep going. But once they came into power, they were far more interested in making sure that they retained power than that power pass on and become shared by people like Shiban Lal Saxena. So, at the heart of India's post 1947 and certainly post 1950 story is this deep fight within the state apparatus itself and within the heart of the soul of what one would call India. Although I don't like to use such words, is uh, is this fight between those who want a radical transformation to create a democracy of a country of the people, by the people, and for the people, and one that believes, okay, of the elite, for the elite, and by the elite. And unfortunately, that problem of elite capture is where the pushback starts, and which is, and the elites have the power. So it's a hard thing to fight.
So in some ways, the
And again,
constitution
if
ended
you
up. Mhm.
sorry, if you look at present day, the current day iteration of the right wing, right?
Mhm.
What is it saying? It is saying that the last 70 years have not worked for us, which is in one sense a great validation of how revolutionary the document of the Constitution was, because it says that even people who were left out of power are somehow able to find representation thereof, and therefore the elites hate it. That is actually the greatest validation of the act, of the working of the Constitution in practice, is that despite elite capture, despite all of this, some power, some opportunities, some wealth did manage to make its way into the hands of those that had largely been kept out of power. And that is the driving force of the current conflict, which is those who say, okay, we don't want any of these institutions, because if we have these institutions, our children will not have the power we did,
So,
which is power without accountability. Sorry.
so two things. One, you mentioned rightly that the perhaps the greatest victory for the idea of constitution or for the constitution is the fact that the people who oppose it, or the people who said that it didn't work for us for the last 70 years, are in power right now, which kind of proves the point of it. But two things come out of it, right? One thing is that mm somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that somewhere between this tussle between what was at the soul of the constitution and elites ended up winning that tussle.
No,
And
no. The elites always had an upper hand and will always have an upper hand. That is the nature of power. And that's where I would distinguish between the state as an institution, and that's
Mhm.
why it's so necessary to look at the structure of the state as an institution and the country as a separate entity. The state as an institution will always have overrepresentation by the elites, and that was something that the commission that put in reservations, what was the name?
Mandal.
The Mundell Commission brought out very clearly that a small percentage of the population, representative of approximately 11% of the Indian population, dominated 90% of all top jobs. And again, look at the American presidency. Since 1776, you haven't had one woman. You've had one person who wasn't white. You've had one Catholic who was assassinated. So, I mean, come on. State institutions, by their very nature, are rigged in a way that those who are powerful are able to use them. And that's why they need to be held accountable. That's why you need checks and balances. Because it is between the fights of the powerful that a space for the powerless appears.
When we compare institutions, and this is a fair point because I wanted to come to institutions. When
Mm,
we compare institutions, especially the institutions as they are in let's say America
mm,
versus as they are in India,
mm.
um, the to me the American institutions still seem far more stronger simply because, I mean, in the end you had a Nixon, um, and there, and you can still say like, for example, recently even and I know the travel ban was overturned and then overturned was overturned and a lot, but like I constantly keep seeing examples where institutions stand up against certain measures from the
Okay,
most powerful
again,
person in the country, right?
yeah,
Whereas in India,
mm, they don't, or
look
at
at,
least they don't.
and in fact, how do you feel after, and because we had a break in our recording, so so I'm putting this in, but how do you feel about the whole Gogoi affair, right?
Yeah, I just feel really sorry for any Assamese, man. I mean, between him and Arnab Goswami, oh God.
Seriously.
I mean, I mean, A, I feel sorry for Gujaratis. B, I feel sorry for Ahomia. But uh, look, examine the Nixon affair as you talked about it.
Hmm.
Who were the main players? You have people like Woodward, right? Who are
Yeah.
who are writing for a major publication which has major corporate backing.
Yeah.
You have the person leaking the information is felt, a person who gets passed over for the head of the post for FBI and who loved J. Edgar Hoover.
Hmm.
So, what I would suggest is the difference between Hindustan and America in this case is that we have fewer thieves and they have more thieves. And when the thieves fight, the space for honesty opens up. And
That's a
unfortunately,
really different way
well,
to look at it, but yeah.
power is corruption, right? So when the thieves fight, when the Koch brothers and Soros fight, a space opens up. The problem with okay, again, billionaires by themselves are
Mhm.
problematic in its own way, but when when two institutions of great power fight with each other, they're generally not fighting because of principle. They're generally fighting for power, but they have to cloak themselves in principle to be able to carry the rest of society. And that allows space for people of principle to actually do something.
You I mean there is a point of view where I mean we can call them thief, but the way I look at it is that there are multiple pillars of almost similar power, and
Yes.
when they interact with each other, um, they essentially hold are somehow able to hold each other accountable,
Hmm.
um, which we just don't like. I was just telling someone the other day that India is a democracy where we put in our votes to elect our king, and
Hmm.
that is how we are reacting. And so, going back to what you were saying, do you are you suggesting that Indian institutions have fared better almost than American institution? Is that what you're?
No, no, no. I'm not saying actually. I'm saying we've done worse because our group of thieves tended to be married to each other.
Why were we not able to because if you take like if anybody studies political science 101, they'll know that the more different social cleavages that there are, even though
Hmm.
we talk about unity and everything, but the more different interest groups that there are, the more solid cohesive the democracy could be, because everyone is
Yes.
interacting with each other in a mishmash sort of a way. So यहाँ
Hmm.
पे our interests match, but there they don't match, so we'll have to find a middle ground. So where
Yes.
exactly did we like what exactly did we miss? I don't know if, and it's a
So
like a long question, I
yeah,
guess. Yeah.
so it's a long question, and I don't think that there's an easy answer to it. There were two problems that we inherited with the state in 1947, and one was that its structure was too deeply unitary and wasn't federal enough. It was a colonial architecture, right? And our Indian Penal Code is still a product of 1860. It was created to make sure
Hmm.
that another 1857 uprising did not happen. It was created specifically to keep the public down, right? So, one was the architecture of the state that we inherited. Secondly, you also have to realize the devastation that colonialism does to a country. By its very nature, colonial power cannot entertain, cannot allow for independent centers of power. So, when I talk to European friends,
Hmm.
certainly German friends and all, and they talk about a history of free imperial cities, right? Which have their own long-standing traditions of self-governance. But these could not exist in a colonial system. You either had to serve the imperial power or you were destroyed. And therefore, after 190 years of colonialism, at one point or the other, any kind of tradition of independence, autonomous thinking, or coordination had just basically been destroyed. I mean, in my city, Gorakhpur, from 1858 to 1860, they were hanging people. I mean, for two
Hmm.
bloody years, they were hanging people. My great grandfather was 8 years old at the time of 1858, and he was the eldest male in the household and wasn't allowed out of the house for years. The kind of savage destruction of any kind of autonomous in independent institutions was rubbed out. How do you recreate that? And I'm the only example, and I'll give you another example of this. This is, you look at East Germany post reunification,
Yeah.
and Germany has struggled so hard with that reintegration because the you know the in on the East German side, you were either complicit with the Stasi state or you were dead, right? And so independent institutions of self-regulation, of self-organization ceased to exist in East Germany, and those groupings they have not come up again. I mean, it's been 20 years. And so you look at the places where, when Germany accepted 1 million Syrian refugees, right? And when they went to places in lots of parts of the west or south of Germany, they found that, okay, there were football clubs that were running. There were flight clubs and stuff like that, and these people were became part of that. And then the society managed to integrate them in and say, okay, hey, this guy's a good footballer. Hey, this guy's a good, mechanic. Yeah, he's part of our society. And so we can, okay, he's different or she's different. They cook different food. They look different. But yeah, there's ways we can interact with them. In East Germany, that was next to impossible because those institutions, that self-organization, no longer existed.
And therefore, you have a huge rise of right wing racist sentiment in East Germany in first post reunification and then after this refugee incorporation. So, what I'm saying is that you have to understand how deep the wounds of colonization run when it comes to what we inherited in 1947. The
Which
second
is a
aspect, yeah,
sorry,
sorry.
go on. Sorry, no, go on, go on. I have a question, but I'll ask after you complete.
No, so the second part of it is also that initially there was this idea, certainly Nehru backed it very strongly, that the temples of modern India would be these vast infrastructure projects,
Hmm.
right? By the 60s, by the way, which a lot of people don't say, is that he'd become really disillusioned by them. Most people don't remark on this, but he himself talks about it very clearly. And the problem when you have these large infrastructure projects is who builds them, who profits from them, who gets the kickbacks. This is
Adani,
your
always
small,
Adani.
yeah, always Adani, Ambani, that small set of thieves, right? And so you had a huge system where self-organization was largely criminalized and remains criminalized. That's what that's how we tend to treat indigenous peoples that we still call tribes. God damn it. And that's that was the self-organization that was left, which was generally anti-state, and the state was unwilling to accommodate that type of thing, so it crushed that as much as it could. And then the people who benefited were small coterie.
So, Omar, we have a, I mean, and what you just said basically is that we do have a history of colonial subjugation. And
Hmm.
one would think that after coming out of such a long history of colonial subjugation, the people in the country, or people at large, would look at any source of authority with a little suspicion. In fact, if you compare, as we've been comparing through our discussion, to America, you see that even the most like right wing nuts in America, people who like keep harping upon Second Amendment, want
Hmm.
Second Amendment because they fear that the government will turn tyrannical. However stupid that logic might be, but
Hmm.
uh, there is a strain
Well, that's
both.
what it's argued about. I don't think that's actually the reality of much of the Second Amendment stuff.
No, yeah,
But
of course.
anyway,
I mean, it has races. Of course, there's racism, and then there is the civil war. But that, like, what I'm trying to say is that in America, I see even when someone like Trump gets elected on the promise of draining the swamp,
hmm.
and a lot of people who were Trump supporters, some of them still are, but a lot of them who are not supporting Trump anymore, say are not supporting because they realize that there is like he's basically as much an establishment as any of them, any of the other politicians. And then you keep finding people who are coming from the right of Trump in local elections, Senate elections, like Roy Moore in Alabama, uh,
Hmm.
who like, so basically everyone is trying to claim that they are anti-establishment, be it on the left or be it on the right in America. Whereas
Hmm.
in India, you see that we almost have this subservient attitude to authority, and not just, I'm not talking about Modi and the last 6 years, even
Yeah,
before.
yeah,
uh,
yeah. My Bap
so
Sarkar.
why do, yeah, my web sarkar, if you can
Hmm.
call it that. So do why does a country that has such a long history of colonial subjugation not look at government with any suspicion? Even now we
Will
like,
bang thalis on the bloody terrace.
exactly. And no, but like, and the thing that scares me the most is that today ANI tweeted out how residents in Bangalore looks like an affluent neighborhood are fucking practicing it. Like, I don't even know what to say. Like, why did we not have any strain of suspicion or like
Anti-establishment. Yeah.
anti-establishment here?
Okay, so two answers to that is that if you're ground under the heel for long enough and enough are destroyed in that fight, basically what you learn is that being anti-establishment is not a good life choice. So,
Mhm.
and the other thing that you have to realize again in India is we, our structures or the people who were in power were primarily people who backed British rule, not those who rebelled. If you, and let me give you an example. What was the army makeup of India at the time of independence? And was primarily, the people who sided with the British in 1857. That was how, I mean, the Bengal regiment, which was the Bengal and Awadh regiment, rebelled.
Mhm.
That has been the regiment that was used largely to conquer India, to defeat the Nepalis, to defeat the Punjab state, to fight the wars in Afghanistan, to fight the wars in Burma, all of these. And then that was disbanded because it rose up against the British. Who who became the center of the fist of the British Raj? It was basically the Sikh regiments, the Maratha regiments, the Afghan regiments, all of these who and the Gorkha regiment, all of those that sided with the British in 1857, right? So there's a long history of those who populated the state telling themselves that they were on the right side. When the state became an independent state in 1947, these people largely retained their jobs. They did not change their mindset. They just changed their masters. What we forget about India is Chori Chora. In Chori Chora, there were basically Indian policemen who were on the orders of the colonial state, incredibly abusive, and with the powers of the colonial state, incredibly abusive over local people over decades until you had this flare up and local people attacked them. But it was Indians on both sides. And the policemen who basically beat Tilak to death were most likely Indians. Who were the people that beat up the protesters throughout? They were largely Indians. So, what I'm trying to say is that we've kind of papered over this history. We made this kind of nod, wink, wink. Actually, we were all in favor of independence. This isn't true. Most of the people who were part of the state were not. They didn't want to, they didn't want to rock the boat. Once the transfer of power happened, they didn't want to rock the boat. Today, they don't want to rock the boat. There is no change in that.
But but Umair, think about this,
The
and I
British,
completely.
the British colonialists who did not want to rock the boat in the United States as colonies were killed or dispossessed. That's the significant difference.
So, but think of it this way,
They fought a war. We didn't. That's also there.
especially, but especially in India, I mean, there is this whole large underclass which has never received any kind of representation, and it still largely accepts uh, accepts. I don't want to use the term oppression, but it's still largely being oppressed, and there is no like large scale, like if you look at India from that from the what you call the leftist university subaltern point of view, India is
Hmm.
ripe for revolution, and India has been ripe for revolution for decades now.
But
And
okay,
yet,
here's the thing about the leftist model on this is, I'm sorry, what do you mean by revolution? People
like,
want rights. To have rights, you need the state. So the kind of revolution that has been continuing in India post the post the social contract of the constitution is a slow revolution of accountability, and it has never stopped, and it has been ongoing, and it has been pushed primarily by the marginalized. This is why India came up with this idea of what do we call it, when people don't get elected into power again, anti-incumbency.
anti-incumbency.
Anti-incumbency, man, we created a bloody phrase which basically said the poor hate us, because by the way, it's the poor that were largely voting. So, I mean, to say that we haven't had a revolution is, again, a complete misunderstanding. If you're talking about a revolution where you get people onto gallows and hang them, or put up chop off heads of landlords, that again, I think that that just misstates what people want. People want dignity. They don't necessarily want to chop off the head of the landowner. That's a really, I'm sorry, that's an elite representation of what the poor want. And
Why?
that's why I think the leftists have their heads up their ass on this. I'm sorry. Wait,
I mean,
they
I,
just,
I, I do not identify with any
no,
leftist
so
group,
I mean,
so
I'm just saying that I think that kind of romantic idea that we will sing Marseille and get out the guillotine. It's just, I'm sorry. That's again, and if you look at the French Revolution, it was largely led and peopled by the middle class, by the petite bourgeoisie. It was not led by the extreme poor. Revolution is not what the poor do. The poor survive because they know trying to put their head up is to get hit. Yes, they do march, they do protest from time to time, and we dismiss it because we're too up our own arses to see them. But it's not that people stop wanting a change for the better of for themselves and for their children. If anything, despite elite capture, despite the massive corruption, despite people like Gogoi and all populating all institutions from bottom to top, despite that, the progress we see in India is because of this unchanging, unerring drive for the poor and marginalized to somehow secure a better future for themselves and their children. And to dismiss that as not revolution is, I think, to me, very insulting.
so first of all, I'll clarify my
Sorry,
point of view.
I get very angry about this.
No, it's okay.
Yeah,
First of all,
and I'm not
big
saying
time
that you're
pacifist,
doing so.
big fan of pacifism, really. But
Yeah.
going back to, and I'll be very blunt then, Omer.
Hmm.
When will we have someone like a Mayawati or even a Muslim prime minister? When in Omer's world does that possibility happen?
Right now, I'd just like to have a functional parliament. I
मेरे
swear,
सारे
man.
बड़े बड़े क्वेश्चंस
We're
को
in
आप
a
बस पानी डाल
really,
दो.
yeah. I mean, Padani, I mean, at this point, I would just like our judiciary to work properly, our parliament to actually hold elected representatives to account, the press to actually do its job. So I frankly think having a Mayawati or a Muslim prime
Hmm.
minister, all of that is insignificant. I think what we saw again with somebody like Obama
Hmm.
is you can have somebody with African blood in the White House. You can have a child of former slaves as the first lady. It does not stop the institutionalized racism that is within America. So I think what is more important is not whether Mayawati is chief minister or the Muslim becomes a prime minister or doesn't. Those things to me are inconsequential. What is consequential is when a poor Indian citizen can go into an institution and ask for justice and actually hope to get it. That's it. It doesn't matter who they are. And I think we're nowhere near that yet.
Yeah, definitely. We're nowhere, and it almost feels as if we're regressing.
Well, the fight is there, and the fight is primarily for institutions because the RSS, the right wing, the Sangh, the RWA uncles that we are surrounded by, their basic fight, their basic beef against the constitution, against the institutions, is simply because they don't want fair play. They do not want fair play. And the fight for everybody else, in one sense or the other, is okay. Most people also don't want fair play. We're fighting against them. Most of them also want their bit of the cake. But the only way you're getting a bit of the cake for everybody is if you've got fair play.
It's
And
like
until,
everyone in the social pyramid above them wants free market capitalism, and below, at their level, wants socialism, and below them just wants capitalism.
well, Ambedkar's definition of the caste system, of that everybody wants somebody to shit on, right?
Yeah,
And for
and
that they're willing to be shat upon, by the way, which is interesting. uh, that that gradated inequality, but I think that hopefully there are, what's my hope? Well, my fear is this. My fear is that we are pretty messed up.
hmm
My hope rests simply because I do not want to imagine a situation where India fails as a democracy. Because if it fails as a democracy, God knows it'll take forever for us to recover from that. I
some
mean,
would
the
say we are already
consequence of
failing as a democracy.
democracies are always failing. That's their nature. That's okay for democracies to be failing at something or the other. But what we are doing is actually stripping away everything about democracy. And that kind of failure, that kind of monumental collapse, would be catastrophic. We haven't gotten to that point yet. My Okay, so let me say this is for me the liberal dilemma.
Hmm.
The liberal dilemma is that to believe that everybody should get as much freedom as they can without limiting other people's freedom is to believe that people are at on the end of the things good, right? Because if you want them to be as free as possible, then basically you have to make the a priori assumption that with their freedom they will at least not be evil. Now, the problem is that that's an a priori assumption, and that assumption is not validated by history. We can't say whether humanity is good or bad. And most of the time, I tend to think that humanity isn't good. But the problem is
We are the
That,
virus.
yeah, well, the problem is, if I say that humanity isn't good, what is my option? My option is that, then that humanity has to be ended. Now, that's a that seems to me too extreme. So for me to be part of a in politics in any way whatsoever requires me to assume that humanity is not evil. Similarly, I have if humanity is not evil, then I cannot accept that Indians are different from other humans or are lesser than other humans. Why should I accept that? If I accept that humanity is not evil, then I have to accept that Indians are not evil. And therefore, it is an absolute must that I must hope in Indians and India.
I mean, it's a deeper like when humanity is evil vis-a-vis the planet, but at the end of the day, it's our evolutionary mechanism that want us to spread
We're part of the
and
planet. We're part of the
yeah.
planet. So
So
it's
like
not as if
in the
we can't
grand scheme of
isolate
things,
ourselves from it. Hmm.
in the
Anyway,
grand scheme of things, kya evil hai? Is I know that's uh,
in
going
the
back
in the
to
long term, we're all dead, as
in the
McCain
long
said.
run we are all dead. Manmohan Singh's best quote ever.
That's
But
John
I
Maynard Keynes.
Huh, I mean, it's Keynes, but Manmohan Singh said this right after demonetization in the parliament, right? That I keep
Yeah,
every time anything happens, I just think of it.
yeah, it's a great
Um,
quote. It's well worth thinking. Policy is never about the extreme long term. It's
yeah,
silly.
because initially it was being peddled as this will be good in the long run, and
Yeah.
Manmohan Singh said in the parliament that no, in the long run we are all dead, as Keynes said. So, but going back to Omer as the writer,
Hmm.
the way and for our listeners, we already had this discussion and then the audio file got corrupted, so we are kind of doing somewhat of a replay. I think we've covered
Yeah.
fairly different subjects and I still have certain things that I wanted to talk about, but I think keeping a podcast to close to 90 minutes is like the best area. But going back to Omer the writer, um,
Hmm.
a lot of the things that you write about or
Hmm.
wrote about in your novel
Hmm.
um, could have like are and it's like every decade we just repeat ourselves, we just repeat everything that we do every decade, and the experience of growing up as a Muslim in a small town India just never changes. It's still the same. So in that light, would your book be any different now than it was back then? And um, is there something that you are currently chewing on to put out that kind of deals with the questions that we are dealing since 2014?
Well, I've basically been working on this book, which I need to finish, and maybe let's say this enforced curfew will do it, is on why Muslims in India have not been part of the global uh, militancy in the name of Islam, and why in Kashmir uh,
Hmm.
rebellion became militancy in the name of Islam, and how basically state policies played into these aspects.
That sounds
And
like a,
unfortunately, also how we're importing the problems that we implemented in Kashmir into India as a whole.
so one last thing that I will quickly want us to cover over is as as someone who identifies themselves, I'm talking about myself, as someone who identifies themselves as liberal, um, liberal, I think, is the broadest term that I can use. Um,
Mm,
when I look at India, I see India as a country which is deeply religious, be it people of the Hindu faith and of the Muslim faith, and of course, you know where I am, you know what my political leanings are, and you know where I stand vis-a-vis the current political climate. And yet, from time to time, I see certain things, especially on the vile, poisonous platform that is Twitter,
mm,
um, from um, a certain section of Indian Muslims, which makes me think that had they just been born in the Hindu family or Hindu faith,
mm.
they would have been as rabid a bhakt as the bhakts are, and that kind of makes me think that while I fight against this right wing Hindu fundamentalist lunacy, how do um, liberals as a community and I guess the answer is that for like if there is any discussion that has to happen, that has to happen from within the Muslim community. And I ask this question to you because of that. How do you see that uh, in the Indian Muslim demographic, and what do you see is the future of that? Like it seems, and we talked about this in our corrupted video audio, where we talked about how the son is more conservative than the father. The son is clinging to the religion more than the father. So how do you see this relationship develop over the next decade?
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, I think, the whether somebody is liberal, conservative, whatever. Frankly, I think these are not or communist or libertarian or whatever. Frankly,
Hmm.
these things don't matter so much. What matters is that people work and solve their problems within the boundaries of constitutional and legal mechanisms that allow them uh, to somehow deal with the issues and achieve their sense of dignity. And look, I'm liberal and I have no problem with saying it. That doesn't mean that I want conservatives to be wiped off the map. I don't. I think conservatives, environmentalists, communists, socialists, libertarians, as much as I may disagree on individual points here and there, are people that I think are necessary within uh, a discourse that is pointing out that we don't have a perfect answer to anything. I don't understand liberals who say we can only have liberal answers. What do you mean by that? How are you? I mean, by its very nature, liberalism takes into account that this is a human solution, and by any solution that you come out with, any policy you will come out with, will by its very nature be flawed because we're human, we're flawed, we're not perfect creatures. We sh- Demanding that is pointless. In that sense, the Indian Muslim community within the state has not been a problem for India. It has not forced India to lurch right or left or anything. It has, in its most natural forms, um, for it is a community that has just taken part in daily life. So I think expecting that there to be a liberal messiah or whatever to come from the Indian Muslim community, or that there be large numbers of liberals that will be in the Indian Muslim community, is, I think, besides the point. I think what we have to focus on is that Indian Muslim communities turn to institutions and look within the boundaries of what is possible to get their dignity. The problem we have right now is that the Supreme Court in its Ayodhya judgment and the BJP in its general politics are making that impossible. That is the problem.
And that's a sad note to end the podcast with. So every time we end an episode, we ask our guests to give us a recommendation, and
Hmm.
it could be a book, a Netflix series that you're watching, and it could be more than one recommendation, especially since we are all trying to social distance ourselves. So
No,
things
so
that
I'd
you'd like for
recommend.
our listeners to.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, then let me recommend two books.
Mhm.
There's
Three,
this
अरे
book.
आप दिल से जितना हाँ बोलो.
Okay, no, 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 I'm just gonna recommend two.
Mhm.
So, I like books by people that have, or about people that have looked at extreme issues in that sense, right? So there is this book by a former colleague of mine, Caroline Kahn,
Mhm.
called Under Red Skies.
Mhm.
And this is a book where she talks about growing up in China and her experiences from everything from being the second child when the one child policy was in place to the Falun Gong to Tiananmen Square and everything else. I mean, I asked Caroline, "How are you alive?" And she basically said, "Well, as long as I'm not counseling overthrow of the government or thing, I think they're okay with this out in English." So I'd very strongly recommend that book. There's another book which I'd recommend, which is by Tom Rice, uh, and it's called The Orientalist.
Which
And
is
this
my
is
fear. Anybody would say any time about this virus, especially the two old men fighting the US election.
it's an Orientalist. Yeah, well,
That
the
it's
Orient.
an oriental virus. मैं बस इस चीज से डरा हुआ हूँ कि कोई ऐसा कुछ बोल देगा.
there's a there's this. Well, I mean, it's in a sense a mystery book. This is about a chap called Lev Nossenbaum who escapes the Russian Revolution as a child. Uh, ends up calling himself Asad Bey, writes a novel which becomes the classic text of, I think, Azerbaijan love story. So it's a
Mhm.
Hir Ranja of Azerbaijan or something like that. He writes biographies of Stalin, of the Prophet, God knows how much. Uh, Escapes Nazi Germany only to end up in fascist Italy and die of a mysterious blood disease.
Wow.
It's awesome book, and it's a type of history that's worth reading, because it also gives you a very clear idea of how destabilized Germany was before the rise of the Nazis.
And does it give us any foreshadowing on not just the Germany of the Nazis, but the India of the Mozis?
I don't know. The past is the past. We have to look at the future with a different lens.
I will recommend our listeners the Omer's book, Jimmy the Terrorist, and I will link the Amazon link to the episode notes so that any of you who wants to find it can find it easily because all of you are lazy buggers. I will also recommend The Island Country, w- uh, which is a book about Sri Lankan civil war, and
Mm.
it's a well written, well researched book. Um, I don't have the book in front of me, and I don't have. I'm just lazy, but I will link the book to the episode note so that you can check that book out as well. And with that, Omer, thank you so much for talking to us.
All right. Cheers. Over and out.
Cheers. Take care.
राम लला हम आएंगे वहीं बनाए।